Somewhere this morning, a gardener walked out with a cup of coffee, reached down, and pinched off a spent daylily flower. Brown, soft, finished. Into the bucket it went. And the plant was not done with it. That is not a figure of speech. For the last day of its life, a daylily flower still attached to the plant is being taken apart on purpose, from the inside, and shipped back down the stem. Sugar, amino acids, phosphorus, moving out through the veins while the petal collapses around them. And when researchers traced where that material was going, it did not go down into the roots. It went up, into the buds on the same stem that had not opened yet. Yesterday's flower is paying for tomorrow's flower. So the question this last week of July is not whether to deadhead your daylilies. You should. The question is, what time of day? And most of us are doing it at the wrong one. This is Golden Harvest, where we start with the mechanism and let the technique fall out of it. Once you see what is happening inside this plant, 5 pieces of standard daylily advice turn over. None of them cost $1, which is exactly why nobody is selling them to you. Start with the name, hemerocallis, 2 Greek words meaning day and beauty. 1 flower, 1 morning, gone by dark. What nobody tells you is that plant scientists have studied that single day for decades, because a daylily is one of the cleanest natural experiments in the field. Most flowers wilt on a hormone signal called ethylene. Carnations do it. Petunias do it. A daylily does not. Surround one with ethylene, and it keeps its own schedule anyway. It is not responding to a signal. It is running a program on an internal clock, and it does not negotiate. Roderick Bileski and Michael Reed, the latter at the University of California, Davis, published that program in the journal Plant Physiology in 1992. Bud to full collapse takes about a day and a half, and through that window, the flower is not dying so much as being dismantled, taken apart, piece by the plant itself, on purpose. 3 years later, Bileski published the measurement every daylily grower deserves to know. In a flower still attached to the plant, the petal loses roughly 95% of its sugar and about 2/3 of its dry weight in the first day. And when he put a radioactive tracer into a fading petal, he could follow where it went, out through the vein, into the stem, and up into the buds waiting above it. The spent flower is not garbage, it is a shipment. You might ask how anybody knows that is real transport and not just a petal rotting. The answer is the most elegant part of the study. He cut some of the flowers off. Detached flowers wilt on almost the same schedule and look identical going down. But the material stops leaving them. In flowers still attached, petal nitrogen dropped by roughly 60% and phosphorus by roughly 3/4. In the detached ones, nitrogen loss was about half that and phosphorus barely moved. Same flower, same collapse, half the recovery. The difference was the connection. And the way the plant manages it tells you how careful this thing is. When the petal breaks down, the tissue between the veins goes first. The veins stay alive and keep working, like a crew keeping the loading dock running while the warehouse comes down around them. So here is rule 1, and it is free. Deadhead your daylilies in the morning, not in the evening. The gardener who walks out after supper and strips off the slumping flowers is interrupting a job still in progress. Wait until morning and you get the same tidy plant, prevent the same seed pod, and let the plant finish unloading first. And the plant tells you when it is done. A spent flower that is finished comes away with no resistance. A light pinch and it releases. If you find yourself tugging, if there is a stretch and a snap and a small wet tear, you are early. Leave it. Come back tomorrow. That is the whole technique. Not a schedule, not a product, a pinch, and one question. Did it fight me? One practical note, most daylily videos skip. Do not drop those spent flowers on the path if you have a cat. Daylilies are not true lilies. True lilies are the genus Lilium and grow from bulbs. But the Food and Drug Administration and the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals put daylilies in the same warning. Every part of the plant, including the pollen, can cause acute kidney failure in a cat. Dogs are not affected the same way. Cats are. So the spent flowers go into a bucket or an apron pocket, and that bucket goes somewhere a cat cannot reach. And while we are here, this is a flower garden video, not a foraging video. I know daylily buds show up in some cuisines. I am not walking you through eating anything, and a plant carrying that warning is not where you want to start experimenting. So if the petal gets recovered anyway, what is deadheading actually for? The seed pod. Once a flower has been pollinated, and in a garden with bees it almost certainly has been, a swelling starts right behind where the flower was. A pod is a different proposition entirely. The petal is a one-day structure that gets recycled. The pod is a build that runs for weeks and gives nothing back. That is the real cost, and that is what your morning pinch prevents. Now I have to be honest, because I said the opposite in another video, and I would rather point at it myself than have you find it. On coneflowers earlier this summer, I argued for letting them set seed. I still believe that, and I am telling you the reverse here. The two plants are not in the same situation. A coneflower seed head feeds birds through winter and drops seedlings worth having. A modern hybrid daylily is a complicated cross, and its seed will not come back looking like the parent. You pay weeks of a plant's summer for seeds that grow into something you did not choose. If you hybridize, that is the point. For the rest of us, it is a poor trade. And the other side, properly. The University of California's own daylily guidance says deadheading is not necessary unless you do not want seeds. A real extension source and a fair position. Nobody's daylily ever died of a seed pod. This is the difference between a clump that holds its performance and one that slowly drifts downward. A lean, not an emergency. So here is where I want your argument in the comments. I let my coneflowers set seed, and I will not let my daylilies. Tell me if you think I am being inconsistent. Now walk from the flower to the leaf, because the same principle is running there, just slower. And this is where the standard advice does the most damage. Late July always brings some yellow into a daylily clump. The oldest leaves on each fan go pale at the tip and work down. Most advice says those leaves are finished, so pull them for tidiness. Here is what is really happening. A yellowing leaf is not dying, it is being emptied. The green in a leaf is chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is bound up with the plant's most expensive protein machinery, nitrogen. When a perennial retires a leaf, it does not throw that nitrogen away. It takes the machinery apart, moves the nitrogen back into the plant, and lets the leaf fade. The yellow is what is left after the green has been withdrawn. The color is not a symptom, the color is a progress bar. Ecologists call this resorption. Rian Arts published a review in the Journal of Ecology in 1996 across a large number of perennial species, and Keith Killingbeck at the University of Rhode Island published a companion paper in the journal Ecology the same year. Both land on the same finding. High nutrient recovery from fading leaves is close to universal in perennials, rich soil or poor, not a stress response, standard operating procedure. I want to label that honestly. Those studies look across perennials broadly. Nobody has run that measurement on a daylily clump in a garden bed. It is reasonable to expect the leaf works the same way. It would not be reasonable to hand you a number and pretend it came out of your backyard. So here is rule 2. The color tells you whether the unloading is finished. A leaf that is yellow-green, or yellow with a base still firm and pale where it meets the crown, is still working. Leave it. A leaf gone straw-colored all the way down, dry to the touch, sliding free when you pull gently, is done. Take it. Notice the plant gave you the same signal it gave you on the flower. If it comes away easily, it was finished. If you have to pull, it was not. Which brings me to the one that makes me wince every year, the summer haircut. The clump looks tired after the main flush, so out come the shears, and the whole plant gets cut back to 5 or 6 inches. That advice is not invented. It is real advice wearing the wrong hat. Cutting daylily foliage back that hard is a transplanting technique. When you dig a clump to divide it, you cut the leaves down so the division is not supporting a full head of foliage on damaged roots. Piedmont master gardeners put it at 6 to 8 inches for divisions being replanted. It is not maintenance. And now you know exactly what it costs. Shear a daylily in late July, and you are not simply removing leaves. You are removing leaves that are still full. The green ones are still making sugar. The half-yellow ones are in the middle of handing their nitrogen back. You have cut the shipment off at both ends and put all of it in the bucket. The plant will regrow leaves, but it builds them out of reserves it was in the middle of collecting. At the exact point in the season when it should have been collecting rather than spending. So the rule is short. Remove what is dead, damaged, or diseased. Leave everything green and everything still turning. A daylily in early August is supposed to look a little tired. In my experience, the immaculate August clump is the one that underperforms next June. Now the second half of the loop, and this is where the soil comes in. The plant handles recycling on the inside. It cannot handle the outside. Once a leaf is finished and off the plant, where it goes is your decision. And there are only two right answers. If it is clean, it goes back on the ground, not into a bag at the curb. Every finished leaf you carry out of your garden is nitrogen, potassium, and carbon that came out of that soil and is not going back. Do that for 15 years, and you have quietly exported a great deal of fertility, then bought some back in a bag. Lay clean spent foliage on the surface near the clump, and let the soil organisms take it down. They are the only labor in this video that works for free. If it is diseased, it leaves the garden. That is the one exception where breaking the loop on purpose is correct. So you need to know which one you are holding, and that takes about 10 seconds. Two leaf problems show up on daylilies in late summer, and they look confusingly alike. Both give you yellow streaks starting near the tip and running downward, browning as they go. One is daylily leaf streak, caused by a fungus called Oreobasidium microstictum. The other is daylily rust, caused by Puccinia hemerocallis. The University of Massachusetts gives you a test that takes 1 second and requires nothing. Run your finger along the underside of the lesion. If an orange powder comes off on your fingertip, that is rust. Those are spores. If nothing comes off, you are almost certainly looking at leaf streak. Why does it matter? Because they survive winter differently, and that changes where the leaf goes. Leaf streak overwinters in the dead foliage at the base of your plant. Illinois Extension and Purdue's Plant Disease Laboratory make the same point. The spores sit in that old material and infect new leaves in spring. So leaf streak foliage does not go back on the soil. It goes out. And I want to pass along something Illinois Extension says that no product label would ever tell you. Their guidance is that leaf streak usually does not kill the plant, and that if you can accept a plant looking rough by late summer, no treatment is needed at all. That is a land-grant university telling you it is allowed to just let it be ugly. I suspect a few of us needed permission for that. If you do spray something, read the whole label and check with your local extension office. Rust deserves its own section because the usual advice misses the most useful thing about it. Daylily rust was not in the United States before the year 2000. It is native to Asia. It was first identified here in the southeastern states in August of 2000, and Gene Williams Woodward at the University of Georgia was among the pathologists who described that arrival. Within a few years, it had turned up across most of the country, not because it flew, because it rode on nursery stock, shipped grower to grower and grower to garden. Now the part that should change what you do. This fungus needs living green tissue to survive. It has an alternate host, a perennial called Petrinia, but Petrinia is uncommon in American gardens. So where winters are real and daylilies go fully dormant, the rust has nowhere to sit out the cold. Overwintering trials at the University of Massachusetts found it does not overwinter there. Georgia observations found the same on plants killed to the ground, though it can persist on evergreen types and in mild winter regions. So if you garden somewhere with real winters and you find rust in August, it probably did not survive in your garden from last year. It arrived this year, in a pot, in a bare root division that came in the mail, or on a plant a friend dug out of their bed and handed you over the fence. Your rust has an address, and it is usually not your garden, which makes the most effective thing you can do about it completely free. Quarantine new plants. When a new daylily comes in, do not put it straight into the bed. Set it somewhere separate, well away from established clumps, for a few weeks. Check the undersides of the leaves, and follow what the University of Florida and Clemson both recommend for new stock, which is to cut the foliage off before planting. You are not hurting the plant. You are removing the part that carries the disease and letting it grow clean leaves in your garden. And notice, there is nothing to buy. You cannot patent a quarantine corner or put a 2-week wait on a shelf, which is precisely why the most effective daylily disease control in America is also the least talked about. Not a conspiracy. Things nobody can sell do not get advertised. Which is why I want to correct one popular piece of advice rather than pile on it. Take advantage of midsummer nursery sales, absolutely. Late summer planting works beautifully here. But buying daylilies this week and walking them straight into your beds is close to a description of how this disease crossed the country. Buy the sale plant, then quarantine it. Now one that almost nothing in the popular advice covers. And if it is in your garden, you have probably been blaming the weather. Go look at Escape for a bud that is short and fat, instead of long and slim. Swollen at the base, maybe flaring oddly at the tip, and it never opens. It just sits there, then dries or rots. That is very likely daylily gall midge, Contarinea quinquinotata. It is a tiny fly. Adults come out of the soil in late spring and lay eggs on developing buds. The larvae feed inside, the bud deforms and fails, and then the larvae drop out, fall to the ground, and spend the winter in the soil directly under your plant. One generation a year, which makes this one of the most winnable problems in your garden once you see the loop. Robin Rosetta at Oregon State University Extension has tracked its spread from British Columbia into Washington State and on to Maine and eastern Canada, and the Royal Horticultural Society has been mapping it in Britain since 1989. So here is the rule, and it is the exact opposite of everything else I have told you today. A deformed bud is the one thing on this plant that must not be left on the ground. Everything else wants to go back onto the soil. This one goes in a bag, in the trash, off the property. Drop it under the plant, and you are not cleaning up. You are planting next June's problem. Damage peaks in June and tapers through July. So by now, you are looking at the tail end. Pick off anything deformed and check earlier next season. And separate this from ordinary bud loss. In a hot, dry stretch, a daylily will abort its smallest buds and drop them. Those look normal, just small, and that is a water story. But open a swollen bud and find a mass of tiny white maggots, and that is the midge, with no doubt about it. Let me clear up the question everybody asks in late July. Will mine bloom again? The common answer is that rebloom is genetic, so go buy a rebloomer. Not wrong exactly, but missing 2/3 of the picture, and the missing part is why people follow that advice and get nothing. The University of Minnesota describes rebloom as a fan producing more than one blooming scape in a season. So the unit is not the plant, it is the fan. That fan has to be vigorous enough to build a second scape, and there has to be enough season left for it to open. Rebloom is 3 things multiplied: the cultivar capable of it, the fan strong enough, the calendar with room. And the University of Minnesota says something about that last one I have never heard repeated on a gardening channel. Their guidance is that reblooming cultivars are not successful in Minnesota because the growing season there is too short. Read that again. Not that they rebloom less, that the strategy does not work. So if you garden up north and your famous rebloomer gave you one flush, you did nothing wrong and missed no trick. You bought a trait that needs a longer summer than you have got. Further south, the same plant behaves completely differently. Same variety, same care, opposite answer, because rebloom is a conversation between genetics and geography. And while we are here, one thing people misread. If your flowers collapse by early afternoon, or you have caught one wide open at 10 at night, nothing is wrong. The American Daylily Society registers cultivars by bloom habit. Some are nocturnal, some are registered as extended. That is written into the variety, and watering will not change it. Now I have saved the best one for last, and it is the reason I want you to look very carefully at any daylily scape before you cut it. Some daylilies will grow an entire small plant on the flower stalk itself. The American Daylily Society calls it a proliferation. A leafy shoot appearing at a node or bract partway up the scape. It makes its own little fan of leaves, and left alone long enough it will often push out its own roots, while still hanging there in mid-air. And because it grows from the stem rather than a seed, it is a clone. Genetically identical to the plant it came from. Exactly what daylily seed will not give you. Now think about the timing. The Society's guidance, and the practice among daylily growers, is that a proliferation is ready to root when the scape begins to dry and turn brown, which is the precise moment nearly every gardening video in the world tells you to cut that scape off at the base. So the standard advice, followed faithfully, has people all over this country throwing away free plants. Not because they were careless, because they were tidy at exactly the moment they should have been curious. So from now through August, before you cut any spent scape, run your hand up the whole length of it, feeling for a small cluster of leaves partway along, usually near a joint. Most cultivars never make one, so do not be disappointed. But some do it reliably, and once you know a plant is a producer, you will get them every year. When you find one and the scape has gone brown, cut a couple of inches above the little plant and about 3 inches below it. Set it in a small pot of moist potting mix with the stem buried, or stand it in a glass of water with the water line right at the base of the leaves and no higher. Rooting hormone helps but is not required. Roots in a few weeks. Then pot it on, protect it through its first winter, and plant it out next spring. That is a full-sized named daylily, true to type, for the price of paying attention. So tell me in the comments, has one of your daylilies ever handed you a baby plant on the scape? And did you know what it was at the time, or did you compost it? I composted mine the first time. I would like to know I am not the only one. One quick thing about the clump, because late July is not the week to be digging. Do not divide now. Kansas State Extension puts the interval at every 2 to 5 years, and notes a daylily reaches its best flower production around the 3rd year. If you have been told 6 years, that is a long time for this plant. This is the week to notice, not to act. Smaller flowers than you remember, and a clump thin in the middle with fans crowded into a ring around a weak center, is the signature of one that wants splitting in early fall. Write it down now, because in September, standing over a bed of green foliage with a spade in your hand, you will not remember which one disappointed you in July. Let me put the whole thing back together, because it is simpler than it sounds. A daylily does not lose things. It takes them back. It takes back the flower over a single day, sending the sugar and nitrogen up into the buds above it. It takes back the leaf over a few weeks, leaving the yellow behind as a progress bar. And it takes back the scape last of all, sometimes handing you a whole new plant on the way out. So the gardener's job in the last week of July is not to fix anything, it is to not interrupt. Deadhead. In the morning, when the flower releases without a fight. Leave anything green and anything still turning. Take only what is straw dry and slides free. Water at the soil rather than over the top. Look at the underside of a streaked leaf before you decide where it goes. Bag any bud that swelled and never opened. Quarantine anything new. And read every scape from bottom to top before you cut it. Every single one of those is free. And here is the part I actually wanted to tell you. That plant is running a closed loop inside itself. Nothing it builds is abandoned. The flower funds the next flower. The old leaf funds the new fan. It has been doing that for as long as there have been daylilies, and it needs no help from us. The only part of the loop it cannot close is the part that leaves the plant, and that part is ours. Every finished leaf that goes back on the ground is carbon and nitrogen returning to the organisms that hand it back to the roots next year. Every one that goes out in a bag is a small withdrawal from a soil nobody is refilling. Over one season, that is nothing. Over the 20 years most of us tend the same beds, it is the whole difference between soil that keeps getting better and soil that quietly gets tired. We feed the soil, not the plant. And this week, the way you feed the soil is mostly by being slower with the shears. So if you take one thing away, let it be this. Walk out tomorrow morning, before it gets hot, with a cup of coffee and no tools at all, just your fingers, and notice which ones fight you. That is the whole lesson, and the plant teaches it for nothing. If this changed how you are going to handle your daylilies this week, subscribing helps more gardeners find it. Then settle an argument for me. Tell me in the comments what time of day you deadhead, morning or evening. I want to know how many habits I am about to change. And tell me whether you think I am being inconsistent, letting coneflowers set seed while refusing my daylilies. I will defend myself in the replies. One last thing, and I mean this seriously. Everything here is general guidance, drawn from published research and from land-grant extension services. Your winter, your soil, and the varieties in your bed are not mine. Check with your local extension office and know your USDA hardiness zone before making a decision that matters. And if you use any product on your plants, read the label first, all of it. Now go take a slow walk, Look at the underside of a few leaves. And do not cut anything you have not read from bottom to top.